Один на другой край, посмотрите, это
김정은 동지께서는 선물 받은 승용차의 성능을 높이 평가하시며 훌륭한 차를 선물로 받은 데 대하여 다시금 대통령 동지에게 사의를 표하셨습니다. 저는 금수산 용빈관 정원에서 푸틴 대통령 동지에게 우리나라의 국견인 풍산께 한 쌍을 선물하셨습니다. 푸틴 대통령 동지는 이에 사의를 표시했습니다.
I mean, most of what is going on at this summit is very ceremonial. So the leaders are going to make some sort of common declaration and they'll exchange gifts and so on, and they'll talk about cooperation. It won't make any difference to the cooperation they're already engaged in. And we don't really know what the North Koreans will get out of this. We know what the Russians are getting out of it, which is lots of ammunition, something between 2 and 4 million artillery shells and quite a lot of ballistic missiles have been sent to Russia, which is what the Russians really need. What the Koreans will get out of it, what they'd like to get out of it, is much more space technology, possibly some technology for their program to put nuclear weapons onto submarines, and possibly some other forms of air power technologies. They may or may not get that. But that doesn't, the visit itself doesn't take any of that further forward than it was already. But what it reflects is the fact that there are now 4 powers in the world, Russia and China, North Korea and Iran, who are actively cooperating more than they ever did 2 or 3 years ago in order to try to counteract what they see as Western influence across the world and to help each other in the wars that they are all variously fighting or look as if they're intending to fight. The worst case scenario here would be that the Russians give the North Koreans some much more sophisticated technology, which allows the North Koreans to diversify their nuclear weapons, make them more invulnerable and more capable. That's about as bad as it could get, which doesn't fundamentally change very much. And remember that as close as the Russians and the North Koreans are now getting, it worries the Chinese. The Chinese don't want the North Koreans and the Russians speaking privately behind their back. The Chinese want to deal bilaterally with North Korea, bilaterally with Russia, and both of them are clients. The Russians have become another North Korea for the Chinese. So the Chinese are not desperately happy at the idea of Russia and North Korea getting closer together. But as they develop cooperation, one would expect North Korean weapons maybe to get a bit more capable and for them to develop a bit more of the high technology which they always crave. Ukraine's in the situation where it's got to hold on for this year. So the G7 agreement to find a way of giving Ukraine another $50 billion as a long-term loan derived from the interest on the frozen Russian assets is a good deal for Ukraine, but it's a bit of a consolation prize because the Ukrainians are not getting out. They didn't get out of the summit in Switzerland what they wanted. They're not going to get out of the summit in Washington, the NATO summit, in a couple of weeks' time. They won't get what they want out of that either. And so the Ukrainians are feeling that they are being supported, but they're not being supported strongly enough by the Western powers, who have been still very cautious in what they'll supply to Ukraine. The F-16s are being supplied very slowly. The training is going even more slowly, and there are real problems. I mean, the F-16s will not be available in any significant numbers to Ukraine until later this year, and maybe not even until next year. And in Kiev, a lot of the politicians and military leaders are really very angry at the West because they feel as if, look, it's not as if we're beggars just asking for crumbs off your military table. We're fighting for you. You know, we are fighting and dying at the moment to help preserve liberal democracy in the West from this sustained assault, as it's now become, from Russia and China and North Korea and Iran and a lot of the dictatorships in other parts of the world, particularly in Africa, who are now lining up behind the dictators and the gangsters to fundamentally change the nature of world politics. And we in Ukraine are on the front line. So we don't feel, they say, we don't feel as if we've got to be grateful for everything. You ought to be grateful for us that we're fighting in this increasingly global conflict on your behalf. And we need you to cross some thresholds a bit more quickly and a bit more decisively than you have so far. What the Ukrainians need is far more Atacam missiles, which is the Army's tactical missile that the Americans have got. They need a lot more of them. They need Taurus missiles from Germany, which the Germans won't supply, which allow them, in the jargon of the military, it's deep fires, it's called. It goes deep into the enemy back rear areas so that you can actually target concentrations of troops and equipment before it gets to the front. And of course, the rear areas in this war in Russia are inside Russia itself. And so although the West is allowing Ukraine on very limited basis to target some forces inside Russia, if the West took that restriction off and just said, here are the weapons, target military only objectives as you think you should, then that would make quite a difference. However, it would also be dangerous. It would be escalatory. The Russians would go berserk and threaten all sorts of wicked things. But on the other hand, the Russians are doing their worst as they are at the moment. I don't believe they couldn't actually do very much about it, but they would threaten that this is the beginning of World War III, and that would actually put the frighteners on a lot of politicians in NATO and particularly in Germany. And so every time the Russians find that the West has crossed another threshold, they always make dark threats. They never actually are able to do very much about it, but the threats get darker and more serious each time, and that's what the Russians would do in this case.